This story is based on the Hinterkaifeck Murders, an unsolved crime that took place in Germany in 1922. The details of the strange events leading up to the incident are preserved in official case files and local lore. In Hinterkaifeck, the snow fell differently. It didn't drift, it blanketed everything. By the end of March 1922, the isolated Bavarian farmhouse had become an island in a sea of white, accessible only by a narrow, frozen track. Andreas Gruber, the family patriarch, was a stern man, stubborn and quick-tempered. He feared no living thing. But in the weeks before his death, something dead had begun to disturb his peace. It started with footprints. Andreas found them on Tuesday morning, stark impressions in the fresh snow. They began at the edge of the dense forest that bordered his land, the tracks of heavy boots, widely spaced, leading directly to the farmhouse door. He followed them, his breath misting in the cold air, his hand gripping the handle of his wood-cutting axe. The tracks led straight to the heavy oak front door. There were no tracks leading back. Andreas circled the house 3 times. He checked the windows. He checked the cellar hatch. Nothing. Whoever had come out of the woods had entered his house and simply vanished. That night, the noises began. Victoria, Andreas's widowed daughter, heard them first. She was awake, nursing her young son, Joseph. Above them, in the large, dusty attic, something heavy moved. It wasn't the scurrying of mice or the rustling of roosting birds. It was a slow, deliberate thud. Thump, drag, thump. Like someone was dragging a sack of grain, limping along. By Thursday, a sense of unease had settled over the house. Keys went missing, the heavy iron cellar keys that had hung on the same hook for 20 years disappeared, only to reappear on tables in rooms where no one had been. An unfamiliar newspaper, a Munich daily that none of the family subscribed to, was found neatly folded on the kitchen counter. The family moved about their own house like strangers. At sunset, they huddled together in the kitchen. "He's just a vagrant," Andreas growled on Friday night, slamming his fist on the table, making little Cecilia jump. "Hiding in the haystack. I'll flush him out tomorrow." His bravado couldn't hide the tremor in his hand. He knew the barn doors were bolted from the outside. On Saturday, March 31st, the new maid arrived. Maria Baumgartner stepped out of the sleigh, her face pinched with the cold. She had taken the job out of desperation. The previous maid had run away 6 months earlier, terrified, claiming the farm was steeped in the devil's work. As Maria stepped through the doorway, the heavy silence of the house swallowed the sound of her arrival. That evening, the weather turned foul. A blizzard swept across the fields, rattling the window panes in their frames. The family ate in near silence, the stew tasting like ashes. Around 8 o'clock, a sound pierced the air. It was the sound of cattle screaming. It wasn't the sound of hunger, it was a frantic, collective bellowing coming from the barn, which was connected to the main house by a covered passageway. "Looks like the feed trough has fallen over," Andreas muttered, picking up a lantern. This time he didn't take his axe. He just wanted the noise to stop. He went out through the door of the covered passageway. The heavy latch clanged shut behind him. 10 minutes passed. The cattle continued to scream. "Where is he?" Victoria whispered, holding the baby Joseph even tighter. Her mother, big Cecilia, was standing by the stove, twisting her apron. "I'm going," the grandmother said. Her voice was thin and trembling. She took another lantern and stepped out into the cold, dark space of the covered passageway. The door slammed shut. 10 more minutes. The wind was howling. The barn suddenly became eerily silent. Victoria froze. The silence was worse than the screaming. It was the silence of waiting. "Mother?" Little Cecilia whispered, tugging at Victoria's sleeve. "Why aren't they coming back?" Victoria glanced at Maria, the new maid, whose eyes were wide with fear in the lamplight. There was no choice. They couldn't stay in the kitchen forever. "Stay here with Joseph," Victoria told Maria. "Cecilia, come hold the light for me." Victoria took her 7-year-old daughter's hand. They walked down the drafty passageway. The air smelled strongly of hay, manure, and something else, something metallic and warm, like a freshly slaughtered pig. They reached the barn door. It was slightly ajar. Victoria pushed it open. The lantern light flickered wildly, casting long, leaping shadows across the stalls. The cows were huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with terror. Victoria took 2 steps inside. Her boots slipped on something slick. She looked down. The straw was soaked red. In the middle of the barn floor, where the herrick usually stood, lay Andreas and the older Kazilia. They were piled on top of each other like logs, their heads bashed in. A shadow detached itself from the darkest corner of the barn. Victoria opened her mouth to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as the figure moved into the faint circle of light. It was a man, broad and tall, holding an axe, a heavy axe used for breaking up hard ground. Something was dripping from the blade. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply began walking towards them with a terrible, unhurried slowness. Victoria pushed her daughter away. "Run, Cecilia. Go back home." The little girl turned and fled, stumbling back along the windy path. Victoria tried to follow, but the man was incredibly fast. A heavy hand landed on her shoulder, spinning her around. The last thing she saw was the dull iron arc of an axe descending from the rafters. Inside the house, the maid Maria heard crushing sounds. She was holding the baby Joseph in the maid's room, praying to the god who had seemingly abandoned Hinterkaifeck. Footsteps returned from the air vent. Heavy. Deliberate. They didn't stop in the kitchen. They went up the stairs. Then, silence again. Maria waited for an hour, afraid to even move. Finally, a soft sound came from the door. Little Kazilia stood there, her nightgown stained with her mother's blood, her eyes vacant with shock. Maria grabbed the girl, pulled her into the room, and bolted the flimsy door. They huddled on the bed with the baby, 3 terrified souls in the darkness. They heard the sound of heavy boots pacing in the hall. They stopped outside the door. The doorknob rattled. Then, the footsteps moved away. Maria breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps he was leaving. Perhaps it was all over. Then she heard a sound directly above her. In the attic. Thump, dragging sound, thump. He hadn't left. He had simply gone upstairs to wait. For days later, the neighbors, noticing the lack of activity at the farm, became worried and broke down the front door. They found 4 bodies in the barn, piled one on top of the other and covered with hay. They found the maid and the baby in their beds, their skulls crushed. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the bloodshed. It was the kitchen. There were remnants of a recent meal on the table. The animals in the barn had been fed, despite the horrific events. A faint wisp of smoke was still rising from the chimney when they arrived. The killer didn't just murder the Gruber family and disappear into the night. He stayed in their house for several days, eating their food, sleeping in their beds, and warming himself by their fire, while their bodies lay frozen in the barn. He watched the neighbors from the attic window, and then, finally, he slipped out the back door, leaving only footprints in the melting snow.